Vladimir Putin has launched a massive military assault on Ukraine, with the stated purpose of overthrowing the democratically elected regime there and replacing it with one subservient to Moscow. Russian forces have arrived in the suburbs of Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Prior to the invasion, many observers believed that Putin was bluffing and that the Biden administration was hyping the threat. The Russian troop buildup and Russian propaganda revived the long-standing discussion in Europe and in the US of how NATO expansion threatened Russia, and the US was in part responsible for the current situation. There were calls from many realists to grant Russia a sphere of influence over the territory of the former USSR and to negotiate the neutralization of Ukraine. These arguments were weak, and even before the invasion, Ukrainian entry into NATO was purely theoretical. No one had pushed for this since 2008, and the Ukrainian military was heavily outmatched by the 190,000 Russian troops gathering on their borders. In the past few weeks, the Russians have put forward a series of increasingly ridiculous justifications for its actions. That Ukraine was a fascist, neo-Nazi state, that it was committing genocide against the Russian-speaking population of the Donbass, or was contemplating a huge military operation against Russia. The invasion was made all these claims utterly hollow. It is crystal clear now that the threat runs only in one direction, from Russia to Ukraine, and indeed to every country that borders on Russia and beyond. Putin's motives are not hard to fathom, since he has talked at length about his worldwide view and strategic objections. He stated some years ago that the dissolution of the USSR was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. In a long article last summer and in the rambling speech he gave on the eve of the invasion, he stated that Ukraine was not an independent nation, but an essential part of Russia, and one that did not have the right to a separate identity and existence. The demands made of NATO and discussions that taken place a few weeks ago indicate that Moscow cares not just about Ukraine, but the entire European order created in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is demanded that NATO cease any military support not just for Ukraine, but for all the countries that joined the organization from the 1990s onward. He wants, in other words, to restore as much of the former USSR as possible, to neutralize Eastern Europe and in turn its buffer zone, and to undo the entire post-1991 settlement of a Europe whole and free. A democratic Ukraine does in fact threaten Putin, not the Russian people, but Putin's view that democracy is not suitable for Slavic peoples who, according to him, naturally gravitate towards strong, centralized leadership. The success of a democratic Ukraine and his desire to join Europe suggests that something similar could happen in Russia as well, which would spell the end of Putin and Putinism. This is why he would never have settled for a neutral Ukraine that foresaw NATO membership as long as it remained a democracy. It would undermine his narrative and would need to be eliminated. We are currently at a critical juncture in world history. If Putin succeeds in overthrowing a democracy in Ukraine and replaces it with a puppet regime, he will have set a terrible precedent for the use of naked force. China will take a cue from this, as it contemplated options for reincorporating Taiwan. The US and NATO will have been humiliated, and a signal will go across the world that American promises of support are hollow and cooperation among democracies non-existent. On the other hand, it's just as possible that Putin made a blunder of monumental proportions. The invasion has triggered massive protests in Russia itself. Even propagandists and diplomats promoting the Russian line have been taken aback by the fact that the invasion actually happened. It has unified the Ukrainian people like nothing else, and they have shown incredible willingness to fight back. In military terms, Putin does not have remotely enough forces to control a country of nearly 40 million people, or even a city like Kiev with 2.8 million inhabitants. NATO has been unified in imposing stiff sanctions, including German agreement to cancel the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The Russian offensive may bog down in house-to-house fighting and produce massive casualties among Ukrainians, but will also lead to large numbers of Russians returning home in body bags. The Russians are already astonished that their military investments are being used in the first instance to kill fellow Slavs and destroy a country with which they feel close kinship. The outcome of the war in Ukraine will also affect domestic politics in the US. Former President Trump has over the years expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin, a pattern that has continued up to the past few weeks when he called Putin a genius for declaring the independence of parts of Ukraine. Democracies do not decay out of an ideological choice for authoritarian government, the way they might have affirmed Marxism or Leninism. They decay because of an admiration for strength and strongmen who can get away with big actions outside the bounds of the checks and balances that exist in the rule of law countries. If Putin succeeds in his aggression of Ukraine and the Republican Party follows Trump in his admiration for what he's done, then we'll be making a decision break with fundamental American democratic values. This would consolidate the authoritarian turn the party took by affirming the January 6 attack on the US Capitol, giving the importance of the US to the maintenance of a liberal world order more broadly. This will be a very bad development for the free world as a whole.